is social and political egalitarianism? Egalitarianism is the idea that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and equal opportunity. This was the driving force of modern European civilization. Egalitarianism started in 1300 with humanism and the rise of the individual, which was increased by the new technology such as the printing press.
From 1600 to 1848, we had an increase in social and political egalitarianism, seen through nobles and elites losing power in music. This time also had a decreasing in religious institutions, and individual thinkers became more prevalent.
Turbulent times from 1848 to 1918 marked the rise of groups within countries revolting to achieve this equality. The push against the state influence led to activists and philosophers that shoved against the boundary of equality.
And the hallmark of European society from 1917 to 1960 is the focus on local egalitarianism in the form of nationalism, ebbing and flowing during and after the World Wars.
So the printing press was invented in 1440, and this enabled the literary arts to be able to spread, as well as the increased use of the vernacular, so more ideas were being spread, and were more available to everyday people. One of these things was Martin Luther's theses. These show the change of norms and values and the ideas of the church, and were spread with technology such as the printing press to other people. It promoted a more direct, individualistic relationship with God, and promoted the idea of more equality, and did not promote the hierarchical standings of the church.
Another decrease in the church you can see through the music Kyrie from Missa Selah Face Fale from Do 5. It's based on a secular melody, but it's still religious, and you can start to see the instruments entering the church, and the Council of Trent ended up attacking this, so the give and take, but still the rise of egalitarianism. And then in the Counter-Reformation, again, the comeback from the church, you can see from the music that from Palestrina, Agnus Dei, from Missa Mini Sposa Christi. It's not focused on God, it's more secular again, and it has a more complex music, but they force the words to focus on God to still satisfy the church, but they're still pushing the boundary.
Taking the same ideas of the Reformation, we get the German Peasants' Revolt. And the German peasants wrote 12 articles demanding equal rights. They used the divine law that Martin Luther was publishing to demand agrarian rights and and to gain equality from the nobles. In the articles, they said that the future should have power and authority, so that each community should choose and appoint a pastor, and that there's a great evil in the constant making of new laws, and that they are not judged according to the offense, rather than being peasants themselves. This was a direct influence into the rise of these ideas of egalitarianism at this time.
The humanist movement was also one of the foundations of our argument for social and political egalitarianism, specifically the rise in individual equality. Petrarch's writings are one of the prime examples of this. He wrote many of his works were written from the perspective of his own feelings, rather than the ideas that come from the community. There's a noticeable change from the medieval period when the emphasis was on the community rather than the individual. In his letter to Boccaccio, he wrote about his disdain for professionals in the medical field and emphasized how he personally felt about the treatment that he was getting. And then also he wrote many sonnets that were written specifically to kind of express his ideas or his feelings for this woman, which was again a very big change from the community aspect in the medieval period. Another one of the foremost humanist writers in Europe was Dante Alighieri. In his piece, Divine Comedy was widely spread by the printing press, as we mentioned earlier, and it was written in the vernacular, so many different people were able to read this. It emphasized human struggle to overcome their flawed human nature, and he also put himself on the same level as many other really huge people from the past. There was a marked change from the past. And then also the last piece of humanism that we see is from Francois Rabelais in his Celebration of Worldly Life. He promoted secular learning and confidence in human nature, and he believed that if people were given freedom, that they would make right decisions. And so he argued for more personal freedoms as a result.
Going off of that, the rise of the individual was very important because people started to view themselves as active members of a society that deserved equal rights and equal opportunities as much as their neighbors did. This idea can be seen in Alexis de Tocqueville's work, and it's usually emphasized that there are two types of individualism, which are egoism and rationalism.
In the Renaissance, at least, there's more of a change in the power for nobles and whatnot. For example, Donatello's equestrian monument of Guatemala. The figure is actually not of an elite figure, it's of Erasmo, and it's a humanist practice of honoring an individual achievement of Erasmo.
The changing ideas of people at this time is definitely evident through the Atlantic slave trade and through the works of John Wesley. He was an Enlightenment thinker who was a leader of the abolitionist movement in England in the 18th century. It is because of him that the African slave trade was disbanded in 1807. He used the grounds of religion to say that this is not only religious but morally wrong, and that these are people as well. It also comes through with the address to the National Assembly in favor of the abolition of the slave trade, which was presented by the French National Assembly. It was presented to the French National Assembly by the Society of the Friends of the Blacks in favor for ending the African slave trade, believing that they were people too. And within that address, they said that they should give liberty to who is due, every child of man and every partaker of human nature, saying that everyone has equal rights and we should give it to them.
You can also see social and political egalitarianism increased rapidly from 1600 to 1848 as rational thought overtook religion and emphasized the individual. You first see this with the scientific revolution. Galileo's invention of the telescope allowed people to study the universe much more thoroughly than they had before, and from this, people started to question religious thought and the Holy Trinity as a result of his findings that contradicted the Church. Specifically, his idea that the sun is at the center of the universe and not the earth. That shook the foundation of people to their core, and they started to look inwards rather than outwards. You can see it through the Industrial Revolution. You see increases and decreases in egalitarianism through the Industrial Revolution. The decrease that you see is people exploiting different people that are working for them. So the machine people who ran the factories, they definitely took advantage of people who were working for them, and so you don't see as much equality there. But you do see people that were fighting back, specifically the Luddites, were a secret organization that destroyed machinery as protests against companies trying to find loopholes in those different labor laws. And so you see many workers that were fighting for the egalitarianism, and eventually you do see an increase in egalitarianism through the workers' protests.
During this time, the Enlightenment had started, which was a time of reason versus religion, and we see that with the works of Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which is a commentary on how reason and morality are not necessarily something that go hand in hand. During this time, it was a lot of trying to figure out people's place in the world and what we should do with that, and you can see that especially with Babeuf's Manifesto of the Equals, that there is a desire for equality in France, and that they will achieve real equality at whatever cost.
Social and political egalitarianism can also be seen in the Baroque art movement, specifically in this painting of Leicester's self-portrait. So, first off, the painting is not of royalty, it is of herself. The Dutch cared more about merit than they did about political standing. But in her own right, Leicester was for equal rights. She was a woman painter during this time, and she demanded to be taken just as seriously by her contemporaries, even with her own school and students teaching them, despite this being uncommon for the time.
And some egalitarianism that we see in music, some increase anyway, during this time anyway. Many of our composers ended up gaining more independence, and you kind of start off to see the change from Francois Couperin. He was completely dependent on the nobility. His whole life was dependent on the nobility. then goes to Joseph Haydn, tried to start his own company and failed, and ended up, again, dependent on the nobility until he died. But then we have Wolfgang Mozart, and you see a little bit of change. He's kind of a transitionary figure. He's still dependent on the nobility, but he hops back and forth between the different local houses instead of staying with one. So then, more independence comes with Franz Schubert. He was never employed by a nobleman, and he was a teacher who taught at his dad's school, and he ended up using his teaching money to pay for his music. You can also see this with Hector Berlioz. He chose not to follow his father, so he didn't follow the family trade, and was cut off from his family for not doing so, and he ended up being a composer for his entire life, and was completely based on his own merit as a composer.
So then we get a change from all of this Enlightenment thinking, and people take their own wants into their own hands. And we see that with the 1848 revolutions, specifically with the Russian Revolution. At this time, Marxism was a new idea, which was founded in the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It is political egalitarianism in its most basic sense, because it is an equality for all. Even though it wasn't implemented correctly, it does create a threat to egalitarianism because of it. But its immediate purpose is to have the formation of the proletariat into a class to overthrow the bourgeoisie supremacy and a conquest of political power by the proletariat, equal rights for all. And it emphasizes the greater equality through the power in the hands of the common people.
Also seen in France was the French Revolution. They had the Declaration of Man and Citizen, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which is a list of the rights that they felt were unalienable and they deserved equally among each other. The idea of having a sovereign nation is very powerful, and this fought for several ideals mirroring the American Revolution. And it also specifically there was the deconstruction of the idea of divine right, so that it would make people not be born to be king, but make it a more even playing field, that they were not chosen by God, but just people as well.
So from 1848 to 1919, there was a lot of back and forth of rising and falling. There was some fighting between it. So the rise of social Darwinism did not help egalitarianism, based on the importance of race, and you can see that through Adolf Hitler's speeches of the Aryan race. It's a little bit difficult to push egalitarianism from the rise of social Darwinism.
And liberalism is another rise in a social and political egalitarianism, specifically political egalitarianism. It's definitely a counter movement to social Darwinism and the idea of state power. And Herbert Spencer, in his Man versus State, argued that the state's power over the individual should be at an absolute minimum. And then Emmeline Pankhurst, in her writing Why Are We Militant, was an example of feminism as a type of liberalism. She said that there's a standard for men and women, and that has become, and that variation of standard has injured our political welfare as well. And that if we wish to better the human race, that we have to believe that the betterment is going to come through the emancipation of men and women, specifically women. You have to have equality between the two genders in order for liberalism to truly take form as it should.
A little bit on the modern art and music at this. For example, Claude Debussy, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. It's interesting because it's dependent on the individual person. It's intended for each person to interpret it differently. It's not based on noble patron, as on a noble patron, or to be one message to all. It's for each person individually. A little bit more. Collett's Unemployed painting Unemployed in 1909. It's a documentation of some of the domestic ills that were going on. And what makes it in the realm of egalitarianism is that she's doing it as a social commentary based on their own perspective, and it's not for nobility or any higher power. It's their own commentary and their own perspective on reality. Yeah, so 1917 to 1960, we do say there is an increase in egalitarianism. World War I was sad. Yes. But at the end of it, people had a little bit of a coming to Jesus kind of idea, And you can see that on an international scale with Woodrow Wilson. In one of his speeches, he said, "We are fighting for the liberty, the self-government, and the undictated development of all peoples." So you see an international desire for egalitarianism.
And while the League of Nations was created, as we know, it did not end well, but it did have a very good idea of what international social and political egalitarianism could be.
World War II, while it was marked by nationalism, a little bit by ideology, but mostly by nationalism, after the World War is really where we see the rise in social egalitarianism specifically. Viktor Viktorovich Konetsky was a Russian general in World War II, and he wrote about the struggles of the human condition from his first-hand perspective in the military, and then also his analysis of the world after the war. He felt that the world wars just had destroyed the people's sense of in humanity, like their hope in humanity and hope of a better future. And so, although nationalism had been a driving force in the World War I and World War II, you see people across national borders agreeing on this idea that we have to do something to fix the future. Like, if we keep going the way we are not going to improve the human race. We are going to just take it down into the depths of what it could be. It could be destroyed, right? And you also see in the Jewish desire to have Israel, it is a little bit of a nationalist movement, but it's more just the idea that these misplaced people groups from World War II wanted to establish their own land and their own people. And so you see a little bit more local egalitarianism through nationalism that way.
And then also in the Cold War, you see egalitarianism. So as stated before, communism, despite its basic premise being equality, was an overall threat to egalitarianism by the way that it was implemented. This can be seen in Hungary, where the communists came in and took over. However, the Hungarians were not thrilled about this. So during the Hungarian Revolution, they decided to expel communism from Hungary. They had a list of demands that they wanted the Soviets out, and they wanted equal rights on the global scale when compared to the Soviet Union. They wanted to make sure that they could present their country the way they wanted to, both militarily and politically. And this desire to be seen on an equal scale on a national level is a very apparent sign of political egalitarianism.
Modern European civilization from 1350 to 1950 was defined by the establishment and increasing dominance of social and political egalitarianism. Original ideas of equality were asserted by the humanists and became more prevalent. Questioning of authority was seen through religious evidence, such as the Reformation. In music specifically, nobility lost control and composers achieved more social equality. Eventually, groups rose up demanding political equality, being looked at during the 1848 revolutions. In the 20th century, egalitarianism is portrayed through the people's desire for local equality and continues on to this day.
Thank you. Questions?
Well, you mentioned the Communist Manifesto and the proletariat rising up to give equality to all. Was that really what it was, or was it just equality for the proletariat?
It was I've always seen it as the abolishment of the classes system, so it would put them all in the same playing field. Everyone would be a proletariat.
Okay. But it brings up the tyranny of the proletariat in the manifesto. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, so we're arguing that although Karl Marx had his ideas of communism, they were implemented in different ways in reality, and so all of his basic idea of equality through economic means was what eventually kind of right came from the Communist Manifesto was what we were arguing.
Do you think that they were? Do you think that we're in like the most egalitarian time that we can be, or is there still like levels after our current society?
There are still levels.
I agree.
But we have made substantial changes within the last 100 years or so. Just I guess for America specifically, you have the desegregation, even though we still do have major race problems in America. You have the
Gay marriage.
Yeah, you have gay marriage. You have more rights for LGBT individuals. You have more rights going for people with disabilities. While we do still have a long way to go, we have made substantial changes since 1960.
Thank God.
Other questions? You do get points for these. All right, I think you're done.
Also,
Why?
I was nervous.
All y'all were nervous.
I'm sorry.
All y'all were a little